In the year 37 AD, Rome celebrated the rise of a new emperor with unprecedented joy. The young Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, ascended to power amid tears of happiness and streets filled with jubilant crowds. Citizens sacrificed over 160,000 animals in thanksgiving to the gods. They believed their nightmare under the paranoid Tiberius had ended and a golden age was beginning. They were catastrophically wrong. What followed was not a reign, but a descent into madness so profound that it would redefine cruelty itself. Within months, the beloved young emperor transformed into a monster whose appetite for suffering knew no bounds. The transformation was as swift as it was complete. Caligula's early months showed promise. He recalled political exiles, abolished treason trials, and staged magnificent games for the people. Then, in October of his first year, he fell seriously ill. When he recovered, something fundamental had changed. Whether the illness damaged his mind or simply removed the mask he had been wearing, Rome would never know. What they did know was that the man who emerged from that sickbed was no longer their hopeful young emperor. He was something far more dangerous, a tyrant who wielded absolute power with the mind of a sadist and the imagination of a theatrical genius. Caligula's reign lasted only 3 years and 10 months, yet in that brief span, he committed acts of cruelty that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. He did not simply kill his enemies, he humiliated them, tortured them, and turned their suffering into public entertainment. He transformed the Roman Senate into his personal theater of degradation, forcing the most powerful men in the empire to grovel like dogs. He bankrupted the treasury, not through war or expansion, but through orgies, floating palaces, and spectacles designed solely to demonstrate his godlike power over life and death. This is not a story of battlefield atrocities or the systematic violence of war. This is something more intimate and more disturbing, the chronicle of one man who held the fate of millions in his hands and chose deliberately and gleefully to make them suffer. Caligula's sadism was not the product of rage or revenge. It was calculated, creative, and performed for an audience. He understood that true power lay not just in the ability to kill, but in the ability to humiliate, to terrorize, and to reduce the proud to objects of pity and shame. The ancient historians Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Philo of Alexandria documented his reign with horror and fascination. Their accounts, while sometimes embellished, paint a consistent picture of a ruler who treated human life as disposable entertainment. Caligula once remarked that he wished all of Rome had a single neck so he could sever it with one blow. This was not empty rhetoric. It was the philosophy that guided every waking moment of his rule. Understanding Caligula requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, madness, and human nature. His victims were not abstract numbers. They were senators who had served Rome for decades, families torn apart by paranoid whims, and common citizens who lived in constant terror of attracting imperial attention. Each act of cruelty was witnessed, recorded, and remembered by those who survived. What follows is a detailed examination of the most sadistic acts attributed to Caligula's reign. These are not tales meant to glorify violence, but historical accounts that reveal the depths to which absolute power can corrupt. They serve as a testament to the suffering of his victims and a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority. The ancient world was brutal by modern standards, but even by those standards, Caligula stood out as exceptional in his cruelty. As we explore these dark chapters of Roman history, we remember that behind each act of sadism were real people, fathers, mothers, children, whose lives were destroyed by imperial caprice. Their suffering demands to be remembered, not as entertainment, but as a solemn reminder of what humans are capable of when mercy is abandoned and power becomes its own justification. The humiliation of the Senate. The Roman Senate had ruled the known world for centuries before the emperors rose to power. These were men of ancient lineage, military commanders, legal scholars, and the wealthiest citizens of the empire. Caligula looked upon them with contempt and decided that their humiliation would be his favorite pastime. He began with subtle mockeries during Senate meetings, interrupting speeches with crude jokes and dismissing matters of state with theatrical yawns. But subtlety quickly bored him, and his treatment of the Senate descended into sadism that shocked even the most hardened observers. One of his most degrading practices was forcing elderly senators to run alongside his chariot during his daily rides through Rome. These men, some in their 70s and 80s, were made to don their senatorial togas and sprint through the dusty streets, while Caligula whipped his horses faster, laughing at their stumbling attempts to keep pace. When they collapsed from exhaustion, he had them dragged along the ground until they could stand again. The historian Suetonius records that several senators died from these forced marathons, their bodies simply giving out under the strain. Caligula established a particularly cruel ritual for senators seeking audience with him. They were required to approach his throne on their hands and knees, crawling the entire length of his reception hall while he watched from his elevated seat, often eating grapes or receiving sexual favors from courtesans. Those who attempted to maintain any dignity by crawling too slowly were beaten by guards. Those who moved too quickly were accused of showing disrespect through their haste. There was no correct way to perform this humiliation. That was precisely the point. During state dinners, Caligula would position senators beneath his table and force them to remain there throughout the meal, occasionally tossing them scraps of food as one would feed dogs. He would then engage in loud conversations about these men, discussing their wives' sexual habits or making up elaborate lies about their supposed cowardice in battle. The victims, trapped beneath the table, had no choice but to endure these slanders in silence, knowing that any protest would result in far worse punishment. The emperor took particular pleasure in forcing senators to witness the rape and abuse of their own family members. He would summon a senator and his wife to the palace, disappear with the woman for hours, then return and provide explicit commentary on her sexual performance, rating her abilities, while the husband stood paralyzed with shame and fury. On several documented occasions, he ordered the execution of senators who showed too much anger during these ordeals, claiming their inability to control their emotions demonstrated disloyalty to the emperor. Perhaps most psychologically devastating was Caligula's practice of making senators vote for their own punishments. He would bring charges against a man, often completely fabricated, and then force the Senate to debate the appropriate sentence. The accused was required to sit silently, while his colleagues, desperate to prove their own loyalty, competed to suggest the most severe penalties. Men voted to exile their best friends, to confiscate the property of their relatives, even to condemn family members to death, all while Caligula watched with amusement, occasionally suggesting they weren't being harsh enough. One senator, Marcus Junius Silanus, was Caligula's father-in-law and had served the empire with distinction for 40 years. After Caligula's first wife died, he turned on Silanus with sudden venom, accusing him of plotting against the throne. Rather than a quick execution, Caligula subjected him to weeks of psychological torture. Every day, Silanus was brought before the emperor and told he would die that day, then sent back to his cell. This continued for a month, until Silanus finally took his own life with a razor, unable to bear the anticipation any longer. Caligula declared this suicide proof of guilt and had Silanus's body dragged through the streets. The ancient historian Cassius Dio writes that by the end of Caligula's reign, the Senate had become an assembly of broken men, incapable of the courage or dignity their ancestors had shown. They had been systematically humiliated, degraded, and terrorized into complete submission. When Caligula was finally assassinated, many senators wept, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief that their nightmare had ended. Yet the psychological scars remained, and many never recovered the pride and self-respect that had been methodically stripped away. Theater of death, executions as entertainment. Caligula pioneered a new form of imperial sadism, the transformation of execution into theatrical performance. Unlike previous emperors who killed efficiently and often privately, Caligula understood that the real power lay not just in death itself, but in its presentation. He staged executions during elaborate dinner parties, positioning them between courses so that guests could watch prisoners die while sampling exotic foods. The condemned were brought out during the meal's progression, their executions timed to match the rhythm of the banquet. The emperor's dining habits became legendary for their grotesque nature. Suetonius documents numerous occasions when Caligula would halt mid-conversation to watch a prisoner being tortured to death in the corner of the dining hall. He would critique the technique of the executioners as if reviewing actors in a play, sometimes demanding they restart the process if he felt the victim had died too quickly. His guests, comprising Rome's elite, were forced to continue eating and making polite conversation while screams echoed off the marble walls. One particularly horrific practice involved what Caligula called the animal games. He would have prisoners dressed in animal skins and released into private arenas to be torn apart by wild beasts, but with a sadistic twist. The beasts were kept half-starved, ensuring a prolonged and vicious attack, but not starved enough to kill quickly. Caligula would place bets with his guests on how long each victim would survive, laughing uproariously when his predictions proved accurate. Those who refused to wager were marked for future punishment. The emperor developed an obsession with death by torture that went beyond mere violence into the realm of experimental cruelty. He commissioned his torturers to develop new methods specifically designed to maximize suffering while prolonging life. One method involved placing a victim in a hollow bronze statue that was gradually heated. Caligula would sit nearby, listening to the screams and watching the expressions of those forced to witness it, finding their discomfort almost as entertaining as the victim's agony. Children were not exempt from his theatrical cruelty. When he ordered the execution of entire families suspected of disloyalty, he ensured that children watched their parents die first, explaining to onlookers that he wanted them to understand the consequences of treason before experiencing it themselves. In one documented case, a father begged for his son's life during a banquet execution. Caligula agreed, but only if the father could finish his meal without showing emotion while watching his son die. The man tried, but broke down in tears halfway through. Caligula had him executed for lacking self-control and mocked him as he died. The philosopher and playwright Seneca the Younger, who lived through Caligula's reign, later wrote about the emperor's death spectacles with barely contained horror. He described how Caligula would sometimes order partial executions, stopping the process just before death, having the victim revived, and then starting over. This could continue for hours, with medical attendants standing by to ensure the victim remained conscious throughout. The purpose was not interrogation or punishment for any real crime. It was pure entertainment. Caligula's midnight executions became infamous throughout Rome. Unable to sleep, he would wander the palace gardens at night and suddenly order the execution of random prisoners from the palace dungeons. These impromptu killings were carried out in the garden itself, often by Caligula's own hand, using whatever implements were available. Gardening tools, decorative statues, even his bare hands, all became instruments of murder during these nocturnal rampages. Palace servants lived in terror of these nights, knowing they could be called at any moment to witness or assist in some new atrocity. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was Caligula's practice of forcing the condemned to participate in their own executions as entertainment. He would have prisoners perform comic sketches mocking themselves, sing songs about their supposed crimes, or engage in degrading theatrical performances before being killed. Those who refused were subjected to far worse deaths. Those who complied earned a quick death, though even this was relative, as Caligula's idea of mercy still involved considerable suffering. The price of grief, punishing the mourners. In Caligula's Rome, showing grief for the emperor's victims became a crime punishable by death. This policy transformed personal tragedy into public performance, where the bereaved had to suppress their most natural human emotions or face execution themselves. The emperor understood instinctively that true terror requires the elimination not just of enemies, but of sympathy for enemies. By criminalizing mourning, he isolated his victims even in death and forced their loved ones into a grotesque charade of indifference or worse, celebration. The most documented case involves Quintus Pomponius, a senator executed for allegedly making disparaging remarks about the emperor's horse, Incitatus. When Pomponius's wife, Pomponia Graecina, wore black mourning clothes to his funeral, Caligula had her arrested during the burial ceremony itself. She was brought before him, still covered in dirt from the gravesite. The emperor told her that by mourning a traitor, she revealed her own treasonous sympathies. She was given a choice: dance and sing at her husband's grave to demonstrate her loyalty to Rome, or join him in death. Records indicate she chose death, but Caligula denied her even that dignity, instead having her enslaved and sent to the mines, where she lived for 2 more years. Children who cried at their parents' executions were marked for future punishment. Caligula maintained detailed lists of those who showed excessive emotion at state killings. When these children reached adulthood, they would be summoned to the palace and reminded of their childhood tears. Many were then executed for the lifelong treason of having mourned enemies of the state. This policy created a chilling effect where families of the condemned would often beat their own children to stop them from crying, knowing that a child's tears could doom the entire family. The emperor took particular pleasure in attending funerals uninvited and mocking the grieving. He would arrive at burial ceremonies for those he had killed and deliver speeches praising himself for ridding Rome of such terrible people. If family members showed visible distress, he would have his guards note their names. On several occasions, he joined funeral processions and began singing cheerful songs, forcing the mourners to join in or be arrested for disrespecting the emperor's presence. One of the most psychologically cruel policies was the celebration mandate. Families of executed individuals were required to hold public banquets, celebrating the person's death within 3 days of the execution. These events had to include speeches thanking Caligula for his justice, toasts to the emperor's wisdom, and expressions of shame for having harbored a traitor. Spies attended these forced celebrations, monitoring for any signs of insincerity. A woman named Aurelia was executed because witnesses claimed her smile during her brother's death celebration didn't reach her eyes. Caligula instituted financial penalties for grief that bankrupted many families. Relatives of the executed were charged enormous fees for disposal of traitor remains and cleansing public morality. These fees were often 10 times the value of the family's entire estate. When families couldn't pay, their children were sold into slavery to cover the debt. The emperor justified this by claiming that traitors' families should be punished for having failed to report the treason earlier. This created a secondary wave of suffering that extended the torture long after the original victim's death. The ancient writer Philo of Alexandria, who visited Rome during Caligula's reign, documented the emperor's treatment of Julia Drusilla's death. The one person Caligula seemed to genuinely love. When his sister and lover died, he mandated that all of Rome mourn with him, but the mourning had to match his specifications exactly. Too much grief suggested you were mocking his pain. Too little suggested disrespect. People were executed for both offenses. Simultaneously, anyone who mourned any other death during this period was killed for suggesting that someone else's death was as significant as Drusilla's. The entire empire was trapped in an impossible double bind. Perhaps most chillingly, Caligula created what historians call the memorial test. Months or even years after executing someone, he would summon their relatives and ask them detailed questions about the deceased. If they remembered too much, specific dates, favorite foods, childhood stories, they were killed for obsessive loyalty to a traitor. If they remembered too little, they were killed for disrespecting the dead in a manner that reflects poorly on Roman values. The correct amount of memory was whatever Caligula decided in that moment, and he never decided the same way, twice. The treasury of sadism, economic terrorism. When Caligula ascended to power, he inherited a treasury filled by the prudent, if paranoid, Tiberius. Within 2 years, he had spent it all, not on public works, military campaigns, or infrastructure, but on spectacles of cruelty and monuments to his own divinity. His spending was not merely wasteful, it was deliberately destructive, designed to demonstrate that he could consume Rome's wealth as carelessly as he consumed human lives. The economic terrorism he inflicted on the empire was as calculated as his physical tortures. The most infamous example was his floating palace on Lake Nemi. Ancient historians describe vessels of unprecedented size, fitted with marble columns, heated baths, gardens with full-sized trees, and decks paved with jewels. These ships served no practical purpose. They were mobile pleasure palaces where Caligula staged elaborate orgies and executed those who displeased him, throwing their bodies overboard for the fish. The cost of these vessels could have fed Rome's poor for 5 years. Caligula used them perhaps a dozen times before abandoning them to rot, considering them too boring for repeated use. To fund his excesses, after draining the treasury, Caligula invented new forms of taxation that were specifically designed to humiliate and impoverish the wealthy. He imposed taxes on prostitutes, calculated per sexual encounter, and then declared all married women to be retroactively prostitutes, demanding decades of back taxes. Families were bankrupted overnight. When they couldn't pay, he seized their property and sold their children into slavery. He taxed food sold in markets, lawsuits filed in courts, and even conversations held in public forums, with informants reporting who had spoken for how long. The emperor created a particularly sadistic tax called the imperial approval fee. Any business transaction, no matter how small, required imperial approval, which came with an unpredictable fee. The fee was determined by Caligula's mood and could be anywhere from a few coins to the entire value of the transaction. Merchants never knew if they would profit or be ruined. Some days, Caligula would approve transactions for free, encouraging more business. Then, he would suddenly charge confiscatory rates, destroying everyone who had been lured into the market. Inheritance became a trap under Caligula's rule. When wealthy citizens died, he would often declare their wills invalid and claim the entire estate for himself, regardless of the deceased's wishes. To avoid this, some tried naming Caligula as a beneficiary in their wills. He then made it illegal to die without leaving him at least half your estate. But if you left him more than half, he declared it proof you were trying to curry favor and thus guilty of treasonous bribery. Families watched their inheritances vanish into imperial coffers, unable to mourn publicly or protest. The emperor turned the economy itself into a game of chance that only he could win. He would periodically announce the cancellation of all debts in Rome, causing celebration, then reverse the decision within hours, declaring everyone who had celebrated to be complicit in defrauding creditors. Both debtors and creditors could be ruined in a single day. The ancient historian Cassius Dio writes that business virtually stopped in Rome because no one could predict whether contracts would be honored from one hour to the next. Caligula's treatment of public grain supplies demonstrated his willingness to use starvation as a tool of terror. Rome depended on grain imports to feed its massive population. Caligula would order granaries opened and distributed to the people, then suddenly close them, claiming the grain was needed for his projects. He once fed vast quantities of grain to animals in the arena while the city starved, explaining that animals were more loyal than citizens. When riots threatened, he would release just enough grain to prevent outright rebellion, keeping the population in a constant state of hunger-induced anxiety. The construction projects he ordered were deliberately wasteful and dangerous. He planned to build a bridge across the Bay of Naples using ships as pontoons, a 3-mile floating bridge that served no purpose except to allow him to ride his horse across the bay wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. Thousands of workers died in the construction. Supply ships were commandeered from across the empire, causing grain shortages. When the bridge was completed, Caligula used it twice and then had it dismantled, the materials sold to pay for his next whim. The God Emperor, religious sadism. Caligula's declaration of his own divinity went far beyond the ceremonial ruler worship common in the ancient world. He didn't merely want temples and offerings. He demanded active, fearful worship backed by deadly consequences for insufficient devotion. This transformation into a god was not about spiritual belief, but about creating a new category of crime, religious treason. Every citizen of Rome now had to prove their faith in Caligula's divinity, and the proofs he required became increasingly bizarre and degrading. The emperor ordered that all temples to traditional gods have their statues replaced with images of himself. When priests protested that this violated centuries of religious tradition, he had them executed and their bodies displayed in the very temples they had served. The temple of Castor and Pollux in the Forum was converted into his vestibule, with the twin god statues relegated to serving as his doorkeepers. Caligula would stand between them and require citizens to worship him as they entered, often mocking traditional prayers and demanding new forms of devotion he invented spontaneously. He established a personal priesthood dedicated to his worship, but membership was more curse than honor. These priests were required to offer ever more expensive sacrifices to Caligula's divinity. Flamingos, peacocks, and other exotic birds were slaughtered by the hundreds daily. The costs bankrupted the priests themselves, who were forbidden from resigning their positions. When they could no longer afford the required sacrifices, Caligula had them executed for insufficient piety. Their replacement priests would then face the same impossible demands. Jewish communities throughout the empire faced particular persecution for their refusal to worship the emperor. Monotheism was not merely a theological disagreement to Caligula, it was personal insult. He ordered a massive golden statue of himself erected in the temple in Jerusalem, knowing this would cause a revolt. When the Syrian governor Petronius delayed implementing the order, understanding it would trigger a Jewish uprising, Caligula ordered his suicide. Only the emperor's assassination prevented what would have been a catastrophic religious war. The emperor's interactions with his priests revealed the depths of his megalomania. He would hold conversations with statues of gods, arguing with them loudly in public, then claiming victory when the statues didn't respond. He challenged Jupiter to single combat, standing in thunderstorms and daring lightning to strike him. When it didn't, he declared himself superior to Jupiter and ordered the king of gods statue beheaded in every temple in Rome. Those who hesitated were executed for protecting false gods. Caligula created elaborate rituals designed to humiliate traditional religious observance. During major festivals, he would appear dressed as various gods, Venus, Diana, Apollo, and demand sexual acts from worshippers as offerings to the divine. Men and women were forced to perform degrading sexual services while he wore the regalia of their ancestral gods. Those who refused were immediately executed for atheism and disrespect to the divine. Those who complied were often executed afterward for showing insufficient enthusiasm. The most psychologically devastating aspect of his religious terrorism was the construction of a bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter. Caligula claimed this allowed him to visit his brother and would walk back and forth between palace and temple, having conversations with Jupiter that witnesses were required to overhear and later recite accurately. If their recollection of these divine conversations differed from Caligula's version, they were executed for spreading false religious testimony. Since Caligula's version changed constantly, accurate recollection was impossible. He demanded blood sacrifices to himself that mirrored the cruelest aspects of ancient religion while perverting their meaning. Traditional Roman sacrifice involved animals, with the meat distributed to the public. Caligula's sacrifices involved human victims, and participation in the consumption of sacrificial offerings became mandatory for all witnesses. The Roman elite found themselves forced into acts of ritual cannibalism, consuming portions of executed prisoners who had been sacrificed to the divine emperor. Those who vomited or refused were killed immediately, their bodies added to the sacrificial offerings. Breaking the family, domestic atrocities. No one was safe from Caligula's cruelty, but his treatment of his own family demonstrated that bloodline offered no protection. Indeed, it often marked you for special attention. The imperial family became a theater of domestic horror, where sisters were lovers, wives were currency, and children were expendable. Caligula's understanding of Roman values included the sacred nature of family bonds, which made violating those bonds all the more devastating as a tool of terror. His relationship with his sisters transcended mere scandal. Caligula engaged in open, incestuous relationships with all three sisters, but particularly with Julia Drusilla. This was not hidden passion, but public policy. He flaunted the relationship, appearing with her at state functions and discussing their sexual activities openly. After Drusilla's death, whether from natural causes or Caligula's hand remains debated, he forced the Senate to declare her a goddess and made mourning her mandatory. His remaining sisters, Agrippina and Julia Livilla, went from being imperial favorites to exiled prisoners within months, accused of conspiracy and adultery, though most historians believe the charges were fabricated. Caligula's marriages were performances of sadism. He married Livia Orestilla during her wedding ceremony to another man, literally stopping the wedding, claiming the bride for himself, and exiling the original groom. He tired of her within months and divorced her with characteristic cruelty, forbidding her from ever remarrying and having her followed for the rest of her life to ensure compliance. His subsequent marriages to Lollia Paulina and Caesonia followed similar patterns: abduction, brief infatuation, then abandonment, or worse. Caesonia, mother to his only child, endured particular degradation, as Caligula would parade her naked before his dinner guests and discuss her body in clinical detail. The birth of his daughter, Julia Drusilla, provided new avenues for disturbing behavior. Caligula claimed the infant's aggressive behavior, she would scratch at other children's faces, proved she was truly his child. He encouraged this violence, reportedly holding the baby up to visitors and threatening to have her scratch out their eyes if they displeased him. The child was found murdered alongside her mother shortly after Caligula's assassination, suggesting that Rome feared even his infant daughter might carry his cursed blood. His treatment of extended family members was methodical in its cruelty. Caligula's cousin Gemellus, who had been named co-heir with him, was barely 18 when the emperor forced him to commit suicide, claiming the young man had taken medicine to protect against poison, which Caligula interpreted as evidence that Gemellus expected Caligula to poison him, which was itself proof of treasonous thoughts. This circular logic became typical of Caligula's reasoning. His uncle Claudius, who would later become emperor, survived only because Caligula found his stammer and nervous tics amusing and kept him around as a figure of mockery. The emperor instituted a policy of random family punishments that terrorized the entire imperial household. A servant's mistake might result in the execution of their entire family. A guard's momentary inattention could mean death for his children. This created an atmosphere of constant anxiety where everyone watched everyone else, hoping to avoid collective punishment. Families would turn on their own members, reporting mistakes before others could, in hopes of being spared. Caligula's treatment of children within the imperial household was particularly monstrous. He would summon the children of nobles and senators to the palace for educational visits, then subject them to psychological torture designed to break their spirits. Some were forced to watch executions. Others were made to participate in degrading performances. The parents, desperate to maintain imperial favor, would send their children despite knowing what awaited them. Those who refused found their entire families marked for destruction. Perhaps most disturbing was his practice of what ancient sources called the family test. Ordained when suspecting disloyalty in a household, Caligula would order the family brought before him and then force them to participate in each other's torture. Fathers were made to torture sons. Wives were forced to execute husbands. Children were ordered to accuse parents. Those who refused were killed immediately. Those who complied were often killed anyway, with Caligula explaining that anyone capable of such betrayal of family could never be trusted. The purpose was not to extract information, but to destroy the bonds of family loyalty, replacing them with absolute terror of imperial power. The ancient historian Suetonius writes that by the end of Caligula's reign, the imperial family had been so traumatized that many members suffered from what we might now recognize as severe psychological disorders. Claudius's stammer worsened dramatically. Agrippina developed a paranoid vigilance that would characterize her later reign as empress. The few children who survived these years emerged damaged, carrying trauma that would influence their own future actions when they inherited power. The justice system as torture chamber. Under Caligula, the Roman legal system, once the model for Western jurisprudence, became an instrument of arbitrary terror. Trials were theatrical performances where the verdict was predetermined, and the only variable was the degree of suffering inflicted before the inevitable execution. The emperor attended court sessions, not to ensure justice, but to critique the entertainment value of proceedings, sometimes ordering retrials if he found the first attempt insufficiently dramatic. The concept of evidence became meaningless. Caligula would accept accusations based on dreams, rumors, or anonymous letters. In one documented case, he executed a senator because someone claimed to have dreamed that the man was plotting against the emperor. When the senator's defenders pointed out that dreams weren't legally admissible evidence, Caligula had them executed for attempting to limit imperial prerogative. The dream accusation then became legal precedent, and subsequent trials featured extensive testimony about dreams, visions, and other supernatural evidence. Torture was formally reintroduced into Roman legal proceedings after centuries of prohibition against its use on citizens. Caligula argued that physical pain helped witnesses remember more clearly and defendants confess more honestly. His torturers developed an elaborate hierarchy of techniques, each with its own legal justification. The question light involved crushing fingers. The question moderate included waterboarding and joint dislocation. The question severe went beyond what most ancient sources were willing to describe in detail, mentioning only that few survived it. The emperor particularly enjoyed what he called defense through ordeal. Defendants could prove their innocence by surviving various physical challenges. One accused man was given the choice of being burned alive slowly or drinking a cup of liquid that might be poison or might be harmless without being told which. He chose the liquid and died in agony. Caligula then revealed it had been poison and declared the man guilty, since an innocent person would have chosen burning, which Caligula claimed would have been magically extinguished by the gods. This backward logic became standard in his court. Lawyers and advocates faced impossible situations. Defending a client too vigorously meant you shared their guilt. Failing to defend them adequately meant you were disrespecting Roman legal tradition. Several prominent lawyers died during trials, executed mid-argument for making points Caligula found annoying. Others learned to present performances rather than defenses, knowing their theatrical skills mattered more than legal reasoning. The best survival strategy was to make the trial entertaining enough that Caligula enjoyed the process, regardless of the outcome for your client. The emperor instituted collective trials, where multiple defendants were tried simultaneously for related charges. The catch was that they were encouraged to accuse each other, with promises of clemency for those who provided the most damning testimony. These trials became circular firing squads where former friends and allies competed to betray each other most thoroughly. Caligula would watch with delight as relationships disintegrated in real time, occasionally interjecting to suggest more creative accusations. Perhaps most Kafkaesque was the trial by imperial whim, where Caligula would select random citizens from the forum and bring them before his court, inventing charges on the spot based on their appearance, speech, or how they had looked at him. One man was executed for having a guilty face. Another died because his toga reminded Caligula of someone he disliked. A woman was killed because she smiled at an inappropriate moment, though testimony revealed she had smiled because Caligula had just told a joke. Intent and context were irrelevant. Only imperial interpretation mattered. The treatment of family members during trials added another layer of cruelty. Relatives were required to attend and sometimes forced to testify against the accused. Parents testified against children. Spouses accused each other. Those who refused were charged with their own crimes. After the inevitable conviction, family members were sometimes required to carry out the execution personally. A father might be handed the sword to behead his son. A wife might be ordered to administer poison to her husband. Refusal meant watching professionals torture your loved one to death slowly, then joining them in death. The military humiliated Rome's military power had conquered the known world, and its soldiers considered themselves the empire's backbone. Caligula viewed them as another population to terrorize and humiliate. Unlike previous emperors who maintained careful relationships with the legions, understanding that imperial power ultimately rested on military support, Caligula seemed to take perverse pleasure in degrading the very institution that kept him in power. His most famous military campaign was the invasion of Britain that never happened. Caligula marched legions to the northern coast of Gaul, had them construct elaborate siege equipment, then ordered them to collect seashells from the beach, declaring victory over Neptune and claiming the shells as spoils of ocean. The soldiers were forced to fill their helmets with shells while Caligula watched from a golden throne. He then held a triumph in Rome, celebrating this victory, parading the confused and humiliated legionaries through streets lined with citizens who understood they were watching a farce. The emperor's treatment of military commanders demonstrated his contempt for martial virtue. Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, one of Rome's most capable generals, was recalled from a successful campaign and required to run beside Caligula's chariot through Rome for an entire day, still wearing his dusty campaign armor. When he stumbled from exhaustion, Caligula had him beaten with reeds, a punishment typically reserved for slaves. Corbulo survived this humiliation, but the message to other commanders was clear. Military success meant nothing if it created reputations that might rival the emperor's. Caligula instituted random military inspections that were designed not to assess readiness, but to find fault. He would arrive at camps unannounced and conduct absurd reviews, examining soldiers' hair length, toe cleanliness, or how symmetrically they blinked. Those who failed these impossible standards were flogged publicly. One entire cohort was decimated, every 10th man executed, because their camp's latrine wasn't positioned precisely east-west, as Caligula claimed military tradition required, despite no such tradition existing. Veterans returning from frontier service found no honor waiting, but rather new degradations. Caligula established a policy requiring that all discharged soldiers spend 1 year as palace servants before receiving their retirement benefits. These men, who had spent decades fighting Rome's enemies, were reduced to carrying chamber pots and scrubbing floors. Those who showed any resentment were charged with disrespecting the emperor and lost all benefits. Some chose to remain in military service indefinitely rather than endure this final humiliation. The emperor's fascination with gladiatorial combat led him to force soldiers to fight in the arena. Unlike typical gladiators who were slaves or criminals, these were decorated veterans ordered to fight to the death for imperial entertainment. They were given inferior weapons and armor, sometimes forced to fight wild animals while handicapped. One documented case describes a centurion who was blinded in one eye before being released into an arena with starved lions. The military was forced to watch these degradations of their comrades, understanding that any of them could be next. Caligula created what ancient sources called the Coward's March. Any soldier accused of cowardice, whether the charge was legitimate or fabricated, was paraded through his military camp wearing women's clothing, while his fellow soldiers were ordered to mock him. He was then assigned to the most dangerous possible duties: clearing minefields, testing bridge stability by walking across first, tasting the commander's food for poison. Most died within weeks, but those who survived were never permitted to remove the disgrace, living the rest of their military careers as objects of ridicule. Perhaps most strategically dangerous was Caligula's habit of executing officers mid-campaign based on omens or whims. A commander might be winning a battle when a messenger arrived with orders for his immediate execution because Caligula had received a bad dream. This created chaos in military operations and taught officers that success was less important than avoiding imperial attention. Some deliberately prolonged campaigns or achieved mediocre results to avoid standing out. The ancient historian Josephus writes that by the end of Caligula's reign, military morale had degraded to dangerous levels. Desertions increased dramatically. Recruitment became difficult as fewer citizens were willing to join an institution that had become a target of imperial sadism. The frontier legions, far from Rome, were the most stable simply because they were far enough from the emperor to avoid his attention. When news of Caligula's assassination reached military camps across the empire, soldiers celebrated openly, despite the risk that his successors might punish such displays. The Pleasure Palace of Horrors. Caligula's palace on the Palatine Hill was not merely a residence, but a carefully designed space for cruelty. Every room served a purpose in his theater of degradation, from the entrance halls where visitors learned submission to the innermost chambers where the worst atrocities occurred. Ancient architectural evidence suggests he made extensive modifications to the traditional imperial residence, adding features specifically intended to facilitate torture, surveillance, and the destruction of human dignity. The palace featured an extensive network of hidden corridors and secret passages that allowed Caligula to appear unexpectedly anywhere in the complex. He used this to spy on guests, sometimes standing behind thin walls, listening to private conversations, then appearing to confront people with their own words. Several rooms had false mirrors, actually windows that allowed viewing from adjacent chambers. Guests never knew when they were being watched, creating constant anxiety that anything they said or did might be reported back to the emperor with creative interpretation. One entire wing of the palace was devoted to what Suetonius calls the pleasure rooms. Though the term is deeply ironic, these were elaborately decorated chambers where Caligula staged orgies that were less about pleasure and more about humiliation and control. Attendance was mandatory for those invited. Refusing meant execution. Participants were forced into sexual acts with partners they wouldn't have chosen, sometimes with their own family members watching, while Caligula observed and directed the proceedings like a theatrical performance. He would rate participants' performances and punish those he deemed insufficiently enthusiastic. The palace dungeons were excavated beneath the structure, a network of cells and torture chambers where Caligula would sometimes personally conduct interrogations and executions. Unlike traditional Roman dungeons that were simply holding cells, these spaces were designed for prolonged suffering. Ancient sources describe rooms of various temperatures, some kept freezing, others heated to extreme temperatures, where prisoners could be rotated to prevent their bodies from adapting. Other rooms were designed to disorient, perfectly spherical chambers where prisoners couldn't determine up from down, or rooms with floors at slight angles that made standing for extended periods agonizing. The palace gardens, traditionally spaces of contemplation and beauty, were converted into execution ground. Caligula had elaborate mechanical devices installed that could kill in theatrical ways. Automated sawing apparatus, crushing machines, devices that slowly impaled victims over the course of hours. He would host garden parties where these devices operated as background entertainment, encouraging guests to enjoy the landscaping while screams echoed from the mechanical horrors scattered among the topiary. The dining halls featured what ancient accounts describe as the viewing alcoves, raised platforms where condemned prisoners were kept on display during meals. They were positioned so that diners couldn't avoid seeing them, and Caligula would periodically have food brought to these prisoners, then snatched away before they could eat. Sometimes he would have them executed during the meal service, timing the killings to occur between courses. The diners were expected to continue eating and making pleasant conversation while blood pooled on the floor nearby. Caligula installed what might be history's first systematic surveillance apparatus. Palace slaves were recruited as informers, reporting not just on plots against the emperor, but on casual comments, private conversations, and even facial expressions. These reports were filed in a massive library that Caligula reportedly reviewed personally, memorizing details about thousands of individuals. He would then confront people with information from their private lives, information they had shared only in supposedly secure settings. The psychological impact of discovering that no space was truly private was devastating. Perhaps most disturbing was the transformation room, documented in Suetonius, but with details so extreme that historians debate their accuracy. According to these accounts, Caligula maintained a chamber where he would dress as various gods and goddesses, demanding that visitors worship him in character. The room featured multiple costumes, props, and even mechanical effects to enhance the illusion. Those who failed to show sufficient reverence to Caligula as Jupiter or Caligula as Venus were punished for religious impiety. The room allegedly included a section where he would transform prisoners, dressing them in degrading costumes, applying makeup, forcing them to perform as characters in his personal dramas before their execution. The final descent. By the beginning of 41 AD, Caligula's reign had created a Rome that lived in constant, debilitating fear. The initial hope that had greeted his ascension 4 years earlier had been systematically crushed, replaced by a collective trauma that touched every level of society. The streets were quieter than they had been in living memory. Citizens avoided eye contact with each other, afraid that being seen speaking together might be interpreted as conspiracy. The once vibrant forums and public spaces had become theaters of anxiety, where one wrong word could mean death. The emperor's paranoia had grown to consume his every waking hour. He saw conspiracies everywhere, but his method of addressing them only created more genuine plots. When he suspected someone of disloyalty, he didn't simply execute them. He made examples so extreme that others were driven to actual conspiracy simply to survive. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most loyal defenders, had been so thoroughly alienated by his treatment of them. Random beatings, impossible demands, humiliation before the common soldiers, that multiple guardsmen were secretly meeting to discuss assassination. Ancient sources describe Caligula in his final months as barely sleeping, wandering the palace at night, haunted by visions he interpreted as divine visitations. He claimed the moon goddess spoke to him, that Jupiter was jealous of him, that Neptune owed him tribute. His already tenuous grip on reality had deteriorated to the point where he conducted full conversations with statues and became enraged when they didn't respond properly. Yet his madness made him no less dangerous. If anything, it made him more unpredictable and thus more terrifying. The conspirators who finally moved against him in January 41st AD were not revolutionaries or political idealists. They were survivors. Men who had watched their friends and family destroyed, who had been forced to participate in or witness countless atrocities, and who had simply reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued existence under Caligula's rule. Cassius Chaerea, the tribune who struck the first blow, had been repeatedly mocked by Caligula for having a high voice, forced to collect taxes from citizens whose families Caligula had destroyed, and made to request daily passwords that were deliberately sexual and humiliating. On January 24th, 41 AD, during theatrical games in the palace complex, Chaerea and his co-conspirators caught Caligula in a narrow underground passage. Ancient accounts differ on details, but agree that Caligula died as he had lived, surrounded by violence. He was stabbed more than 30 times, with various sources claiming different guardsmen wanted to ensure they had personally struck a blow. His wife, Caesonia, and infant daughter were killed shortly after, the child's head dashed against a wall. The violence was excessive, brutal, and final, reflecting years of accumulated rage. The reaction in Rome was telling. There were no public outpourings of grief, no demands to find and punish the assassins, no lionization of the fallen emperor. Instead, there was shocked relief, as if Rome had been holding its breath for 4 years and could finally exhale. The Senate immediately ordered the destruction of Caligula's statues, though many had already been torn down by mobs in the first hours after his death became public. His name was ordered erased from public inscriptions, a damnatio memoriae that reflected Rome's desire to forget that such a ruler had ever existed. Yet the psychological damage couldn't be erased so easily. Caligula's reign had demonstrated that Roman institutions, the Senate, the law, the military, were insufficient to constrain an emperor determined to rule through terror. The precedent had been set. Future emperors like Nero would reference Caligula's reign. sometimes with approval. The brief period of optimism under Claudius couldn't fully restore the Republic's dying spirit. The Reign of Terror had revealed a fundamental truth about imperial Rome. Absolute power, when wielded by a sadistic mind, could transform civilization itself into an instrument of suffering. The ancient historians who recorded these events struggled with how to present them. Suetonius, writing 70 years later, still seemed disturbed by the accounts he had compiled. Cassius Dio, nearly 2 centuries removed, treated Caligula's reign as an aberration that nonetheless revealed something important about power and human nature. Modern historians debate which specific atrocities can be verified versus which might be exaggerations, but the core narrative remains consistent. For less than 4 years, Rome was ruled by a man who transformed governing into a performance of sadism. Conclusion: the legacy of cruelty. Caligula's reign lasted only 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. In that brief span, he fundamentally altered Rome's understanding of imperial power. Before Caligula, Romans could believe that emperors, while possessing supreme authority, would exercise it within some framework of tradition, law, and basic humanity. After Caligula, they knew better. He had demonstrated that an emperor could do absolutely anything to anyone, at any time, for any reason or no reason at all. This knowledge changed Rome in ways that would echo through the remaining centuries of the empire. The immediate aftermath of his death saw attempts to restore republican values, to somehow return to an earlier, more virtuous Rome. These attempts failed. The Praetorian Guard, which had stood by during Caligula's atrocities, now understood its own power and would kill or make emperors based on who offered the largest bribe. The precedent of military force determining succession had been reinforced. The Senate, so thoroughly humiliated during Caligula's reign, never fully recovered its dignity or authority. Even good emperors like Claudius or Marcus Aurelius would rule in Caligula's shadow, knowing what imperial power could become. Modern psychological analysis suggests Caligula may have suffered from various conditions: sociopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, encephalitis, or some combination of these. But such diagnoses, while interesting, risk explaining away rather than explaining his actions. Whatever Caligula's mental state, he made choices, conscious, deliberate choices, about how to wield absolute power. He chose cruelty over mercy, humiliation over dignity, and terror over justice. These were not symptoms, but strategies, methods for demonstrating and maintaining control. The question that haunted ancient Rome and continues to trouble us today is how such a person could rise to power and maintain it for nearly 4 years. Part of the answer lies in the structure of Roman imperial succession, which had no formal rules and thus could elevate anyone who had the right bloodline and military support. Part lies in the gradual nature of his descent into obvious madness, with each new atrocity seeming like perhaps the last before things would return to normal. And part lies in the very human tendency to rationalize and adapt to horror, to survive by accepting the unacceptable. Caligula's victims numbered in the thousands directly and millions indirectly through his economic terrorism and creation of a society based on fear. But beyond the body count, his reign destroyed something less tangible but equally important: the social trust necessary for civilization to function. After Caligula, Romans looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who had been an informer, who had participated in atrocities, who had betrayed friends to survive. This breakdown of social cohesion weakened Rome in ways that military defeats never could. The ancient historians preserved these accounts not as entertainment but as warning. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and others documented Caligula's cruelties in painful detail because they believed future generations needed to understand what absolute power without accountability could become. They wanted readers to recognize the warning signs, to understand how a reign of terror could begin with small violations of norms and precedents, each one making the next more acceptable until atrocity became routine. There is a dark irony in how Caligula is remembered today. His name has become synonymous with imperial madness, yet many people know only vague outlines of his reign. He has been reduced to a caricature, the crazy emperor who wanted to make his horse a consul. A story that may be apocryphal, and which, even if true, pales compared to his actual documented atrocities. This reduction of horror to anecdote is itself troubling, as it allows us to maintain distance from the real suffering his reign inflicted. The legacy of Caligula extends beyond Rome to every subsequent discussion of absolute power. His reign stands as perhaps the clearest historical example of why no individual should wield unchecked authority. Political philosophers from Montesquieu to the American founders referenced Roman emperors generally and Caligula specifically when arguing for separation of powers and constitutional limits on authority. The very concept of checks and balances exists partly because history has shown us what happens when there are none. In the end, Caligula's importance lies not in the specifics of his cruelties, shocking as they are, but in what his reign reveals about power, human nature, and social order. He demonstrated that civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe, that the veneer of law and custom can be stripped away by someone willing to ignore all constraints. He showed that ordinary people can be forced to participate in atrocities through a combination of fear and institutional pressure. And he proved that once such a descent begins, stopping it requires not just courage, but the willingness to risk everything, as his assassins ultimately did. We study Caligula not to dwell in darkness, but to understand it, to recognize the conditions that allow such figures to rise and the mechanisms by which they maintain power. His reign ended nearly 2,000 years ago, but the warnings it offers remain urgently relevant. Wherever power becomes concentrated without accountability, wherever cruelty becomes policy, wherever human dignity is sacrificed to the whims of authority, Caligula's shadow falls. The best way to honor his victims is to ensure that history's lessons are learned, remembered, and applied, so that such a reign of terror never happens again.